My family always loved to tell people I was just playing nurse. They mocked my life choices, treating me like the ultimate household failure. But when my young nephew went under the dark water at my brother's lavish lake party, I was the only one who jumped in. I had the boy breathing and stabilized long before the ambulance even arrived. Later that afternoon, standing in the busy emergency room waiting area, the hospital's chief of medicine stopped dead in his tracks. Dr. Washington, he said, his voice carrying over the crowd as he looked at me completely baffled. Why on earth are you sitting out here in the waiting room? My mother's head snapped toward me so fast I thought she might need a neck brace. She had literally just introduced me to the triage nurse as the family babysitter. I am Yakina. I am 31 years old, and before I reveal exactly how I dismantled my family's entire fake upper crust life in a single afternoon, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through the disrespect of people who completely underestimated your worth. Growing up in Atlanta, our family dynamics were always defined by who had the most money to show off. My brother Darius was the undisputed golden child. He could absolutely do no wrong in my mother Brenda's eyes. Today was supposed to be a joyous celebration of freedom. It was our annual Juneteenth cookout hosted this year at the sprawling Lake Oconee property Darius had recently acquired. The humid Georgia air was thick with the rich, smoky scent of hickory wood-charred ribs and barbecue sauce. Upbeat music blasted from massive outdoor speakers, battling against the loud, joyful chatter of aunts, uncles, and cousins who had driven up for the holiday. From the outside, looking at the infinity pool blending into the lake and the luxury cars parked on the long gravel driveway, we looked like the absolute pinnacle of success. But beneath that shiny surface, this family was drowning in toxic expectations and blatant favoritism. I was sitting on a plush outdoor sofa on the expansive wooden deck, quietly sipping my sweet tea and minding my own business. I wore a simple yellow sundress, intentionally keeping a low profile. I had learned years ago that trying to share my actual life with these people only invited ridicule and demands for money. They preferred the pathetic narrative they had constructed for me. In their minds, I was the struggling, aimless middle child who had ruined her life and was desperately jealous of her older brother. I watched my sister-in-law Chloe holding court by the outdoor kitchen. Chloe was a 32-year-old white woman who had married Darius 5 years ago and immediately adopted a sickening sense of superiority that my mother eagerly validated. Chloe loved the aesthetic of wealth more than anything. She was currently draped in a designer resort wear outfit that probably cost more than my cousin's maid in an entire month. She held a half-empty mimosa, laughing loudly with a group of Darius's potential real estate investors. Darius, at 34, fancied himself a real estate mogul. He wore a crisp linen shirt unbuttoned halfway down his chest, playing the perfect host to his wealthy guests. They completely ignored the actual family members present, focusing solely on the people who could elevate their social standing. I was just setting my glass down on the patio table when Chloe abruptly excused herself from her elite group. I could see pure annoyance tightening her features as she marched across the wooden deck directly toward me. She was carrying her 3-year-old son Leo on one hip and holding a massive, heavily logoed Gucci diaper bag in her free hand. I took a deep breath, mentally bracing myself for whatever performative nonsense she was about to initiate. Chloe did not even bother to say hello. She stopped right in front of me, dropping Leo roughly onto his feet so he could run off toward the edge of the deck. Without missing a single beat, she swung the heavy Gucci diaper bag and threw it straight at my chest. A bottle of expensive sunscreen slipped out of the side pocket and hit my collarbone before tumbling onto the deck cushions. "Jakina, watch Leo for the rest of the afternoon," she demanded. Her voice was intentionally loud enough to carry over the music, ensuring several relatives turned their heads to watch the spectacle. I caught the heavy bag, feeling the leather straps digging into my palms. I looked up at her perfectly contoured face, feeling the familiar sting of her absolute disrespect. "Excuse me," I asked quietly, keeping my tone perfectly level. "Do not play dumb." Chloe sighed, rolling her eyes with exaggerated exhaustion. "I need you to watch him right now." Darius and I have to entertain the VIP guests on the pontoon boat. We are about to finalize a massive deal, and we cannot have a toddler running around screaming while we pop champagne. Besides, you are used to this kind of thing, right? You are always playing nurse at that little clinic of yours, so you have plenty of practice wiping noses and handing out band-aids. The sheer audacity of her statement hung in the heavy summer air. Playing nurse. That was the family's favorite inside joke. They loved to diminish the grueling, life-saving work of healthcare professionals just because it did not come with a corner office and a country club membership. But Chloe did not know the reality of my daily life. She did not know what I actually did when I put on my scrubs every single morning. I slowly stood up from the sofa. The deck suddenly felt very quiet as the relatives nearby paused their card games to watch the drama unfold. I looked down at the Gucci bag in my hands. Then, with a fluid, deliberate motion, I tossed it right past her. The heavy designer bag landed squarely in the large plastic trash can reserved for paper plates and empty beer bottles. It made a highly satisfying sound as it settled among the garbage. "I am here to celebrate the holiday, Chloe," I said, my voice echoing clearly across the patio. "I am a guest at this party, not your unpaid domestic help. If you and your husband want to go play pretend billionaires on a boat, you should have hired an actual nanny." Chloe's jaw dropped so fast it practically hit the wooden planks. She stared at the trash can in absolute horror, her face turning a deep shade of crimson. "Are you out of your mind?" she shrieked, pointing a manicured finger at my face. "Do you have any idea how much that bag costs? You cannot just throw my things away because you are bitter and broke." I smoothed down the front of my sundress, completely unbothered by her screaming. "I am not bitter at all," I replied calmly. "But I will not be ordered around by someone who thinks marrying my brother gives her the right to treat me like a subordinate. Watch your own child." Chloe let out a humorless, condescending laugh. It was the same mocking sound she used whenever she wanted to put me in my place. "Please, Jakina, stop acting like your time is so incredibly valuable. We all know the truth. You are just embarrassed. You are projecting your own failures onto me because you cannot handle the fact that Darius is building an empire while you are stuck at the absolute bottom. You dropped out of your nursing program 8 years ago because you could not handle the coursework. Now you spend your days scraping rust off medical trays at some underfunded community health center. Helping us out today is the most useful thing you could possibly do for this family." The cruelty in her words was entirely intentional, designed to hit every insecurity my family thought I had. Dropping out of the nursing program was the story they clung to with pathetic desperation. It was the exact narrative my mother had spun to explain why I suddenly moved to Baltimore all those years ago. They thought I ran away in pure disgrace because the academics were just too hard for me. They thought I was currently working as a low-level clinic assistant, barely scraping by on minimum wage. I had never corrected them because their ignorant assumptions kept them out of my real life and my real bank accounts. I looked at Chloe, feeling a deep, dark amusement bubbling up inside me. "You really think you know everything about my life, do not you?" I asked softly. "You think because I do not flash brand names and post luxury car steering wheels on social media that I am somehow beneath you?" Before Chloe could fire back another vicious insult, heavy footsteps pounded across the wooden deck. My mother, Brenda, came storming over from the barbecue grill. Her face was contorted with absolute fury. She shoved her way past two of my cousins and stopped right next to Chloe. In her right hand, she wielded a massive metal barbecue tong, pointing the grease-stained tip directly at my face. "How dare you talk back to your sister-in-law like that?" my mother yelled, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "What is wrong with you, Jakina? Chloe and your brother are trying to build generational wealth for this family. Darius just bought this beautiful lake house, and all you can do is sit here and be a jealous, spiteful little girl. Pick that bag out of the trash right now and go find your nephew." I stared at the metal tongs pointing at my eyes, feeling the familiar weight of my mother's blind favoritism crushing down on me. I did not move a single muscle. "Generational wealth," I repeated, letting a small, cold smile touch my lips. Are you talking about the generational wealth funded by that incredibly risky commercial loan Darius hid from you last month? My mother froze the barbecue tongs, trembling slightly in her grip. I had just dropped a match into a room full of gasoline, and as the silence stretched out over the lake, I prepared to watch the whole fake empire burn to the ground. The heavy metal barbecue tongs trembled just inches from my eyes, dripping a single thick drop of dark hickory barbecue sauce onto the pristine wooden deck between us. The smell of roasting meat and expensive cigars mixed with the sudden sour stench of tension. My mother Brenda stood there breathing heavily, her chest heaving under her expensive silk designer blouse. The entire party had ground to an absolute suffocating halt. The upbeat rhythm and blues music still blasted from the massive outdoor speakers, but the loud, joyful chatter of the holiday cookout had completely evaporated into the humid Georgia air. My cousins, aunts, and uncles were frozen in place, holding their red plastic cups and heavy paper plates, their eyes darting nervously between me and the undeniable matriarch of the family. My mother always demanded complete and total submission, and she was used to getting it without question. Her eyes, dark and furiously wide, bore into mine with a familiar hatred that I had grown completely numb to over the years. "How dare you talk back to your sister-in-law like that?" She yelled, her voice sharp enough to shatter glass. "What is wrong with you, Jakina? Chloe and your brother are trying to build generational wealth for this family. Darius just bought this beautiful lake house, and all you can do is sit here and be a jealous, spiteful little girl. Pick that bag out of the trash right now and go find your nephew." I did not flinch. I did not move a single muscle. 10 years ago, the sheer force of her public rage would have reduced me to a stuttering, apologetic mess. I would have dropped to my knees in front of all these relatives, fished that gaudy, heavy Gucci bag out of the garbage, and begged for her forgiveness while choking back tears. But I was not a terrified, approval-seeking teenager anymore. I was a 31-year-old woman who spent her days making split-second life and death decisions in a chaotic emergency trauma center. A woman screaming at me over a discarded diaper bag at a family barbecue was profoundly unimpressive. I slowly reached over to the glass patio table beside me and picked up a crisp white linen napkin. I deliberately took my absolute time meticulously wiping a microscopic speck of condensation from my fingers. I could see Chloe standing safely behind my mother, a smug, victorious smile plastered across her perfectly contoured face. Chloe loved nothing more than watching my mother tear me down in public. It validated her own cruel behavior and secured her spot at the top of the family hierarchy. I looked back at my mother, maintaining unbreakable eye contact as I folded the napkin with slow, deliberate precision and set it down. Generational wealth. I repeated slowly, letting a small, cold smile touch the corners of my lips. The words felt heavy and thick in the humid air. The truth was a weapon I had kept holstered for months, waiting for the exact right moment to use it. "That is a fascinating choice of words, Mother. I am just curious. What kind of generational wealth are we actually talking about here today?" My mother lowered the tongs just a fraction, her eyes narrowing with intense suspicion. She was not used to me speaking back, let alone with such chilling, unwavering authority. "What are you babbling about now?" she snapped, glancing nervously around the expansive deck to ensure the extended family was still watching my supposed humiliation. I took a slow, measured step forward, closing the physical distance between us, until I could smell the heavy perfume she wore. "I'm talking about this beautiful, sprawling lake house," I said, gesturing to the massive property and the private dock with a sweeping motion of my hand. "The one you are all so incredibly proud to show off. I just find it interesting that you call this an empire. Tell me, Mother, does an empire usually run on a commercial mortgage loan with an 18% interest rate? Because that is exactly what your golden boy Darius secretly signed last month, just to keep this property from going into immediate foreclosure before he even hosted this holiday party." The silence that followed my words was absolute and devastating. It was as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the space over the lake. The upbeat music playing from the outdoor speakers suddenly sounded painfully loud and out of place against the dead quiet of the crowd. Chloe let out a sharp, genuine gasp, stepping backward, as if she had been physically struck in the chest. Her eyes darted wildly toward the luxury pontoon boat bobbing near the edge of the dock, where Darius was completely oblivious, pouring expensive champagne for his potential investors. My mother froze entirely. The warm, vibrant color drained completely from her face, leaving her looking suddenly old and frail under the harsh glare of the summer sun. The heavy metal barbecue tongs slipped from her trembling grip, clattering loudly onto the wooden deck planks. Frantic whispers immediately broke out among the gathered relatives. My Aunt Patricia leaned into my cousin, her eyes wide with unhidden shock. An 18% interest rate, someone muttered loudly in the background. That is absolute financial suicide. I watched the painful realization hit my mother like a freight train. She knew Darius had been struggling with his business ventures, but she had actively chosen to look the other way, fiercely preferring the shiny illusion of success over the dark reality of his massive, crushing debts. But instead of turning her anger toward the son who had lied to her face, she did what she always did. She redirected all her panic and fury right back at the designated family scapegoat. "You are a liar!" my mother shrieked, her voice cracking with sheer unadulterated desperation. She took an aggressive step toward me, her hands balled into tight, shaking fists at her sides. "You are nothing but a jealous, spiteful liar. You cannot stand to see your older brother succeed. You have resented him since the day you were born because he was the golden child. Because he rightfully inherited your grandfather's massive investment fund and you got absolutely nothing." She was grasping at desperate straws, now pulling up decades-old family history to deflect from the humiliating financial truth I had just exposed. "Darius deserved that money," she screamed, pointing a trembling finger aggressively at my chest. She was panting now, her chest heaving, as she spat the hateful words at me, desperate to regain control of the narrative. "He is a visionary. He takes risks. And what exactly are you? You are a complete failure. You dropped out of your nursing program 8 years ago because you simply were not smart enough to pass the exams. You ran away to Baltimore because you could not stand being the loser of this family. Now you are drowning in suffocating student loan debt while you wipe down dirty counters at a free community clinic. Babysitting Darius's son is the absolute greatest privilege you have left in this world. You should be down on your knees thanking him for even letting you step foot onto this luxury property." Her vicious words were meant to completely destroy me, to shove me forcefully back into the tiny, insignificant, pathetic box she had constructed for me my entire life. But they only fueled the cold, steady fire burning in my chest. She was blindly defending a man who was actively draining her own retirement savings to fund a fake plastic lifestyle. She was insulting my advanced education, my demanding career, and my intrinsic worth, all to protect a fragile, crumbling lie. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, refusing to break eye contact for even a fraction of a second. "You can scream all you want, Mother," I said, my voice projecting clearly and calmly across the crowded deck. "You can call me a dropout. You can call me a failure to make yourself feel better. You can pretend all day long that Darius is a financial genius while his creditors circle this lake house like hungry vultures. But screaming at me does not change the math. And the math says this entire family is completely bankrupt." I watched her face contort with a rage so deep and visceral, it looked almost demonic. She raised her right hand high in the air, stepping forward with her teeth bared, as if she was actually going to strike me across the face right in front of the entire extended family. I did not step back. I did not blink. I was fully prepared to catch her wrist and finish this conversation once and for all. The physical tension was so incredibly thick it felt like the humid air itself was vibrating with raw electricity. The entire deck was holding its collective breath, eyes wide, waiting for the physical blow to land. But before my mother's raised hand could connect with my face, the furious confrontation was violently shattered by a sound that made the blood run instantly cold in my veins. It was a massive, violent splash coming from the deep end of the wooden dock, the unmistakable, heavy sound of a small body hitting the dark, murky lake water. For a split second, nobody moved. The argument hung, suspended in time. Then a chorus of high-pitched, absolutely terrified screams erupted from the group of children playing near the edge of the water. The screams cut through the heavy summer air, sharp, desperate, and filled with genuine horror. Someone fell in. A little girl shrieked at the top of her lungs, pointing a violently trembling finger toward the dark, churning water beneath the luxury pontoon boat. He went under the water. He is not coming back up. Help him, please, help him. The petty, toxic family drama vanished into thin air in an instant, replaced by a suffocating, paralyzing wave of pure panic. It was Leo. I saw the bright flash of his red designer swim trunks disappearing beneath the murky green surface of Lake Oconee. My body reacted before my conscious mind even had time to process the sheer horror of the situation. 10 years of rigorous emergency trauma training kicked in, completely overriding every normal human instinct to panic or hesitate. I dropped my glass of sweet tea, the crystal shattering against the deck planks, and sprinted toward the wooden railing. I fully expected his mother to be right beside me. I expected Chloe to tear past me, driven by primal maternal instinct to save her only child. But as I reached the very edge of the dock, I saw Chloe frozen exactly 3 feet away. She was clutching the sides of her face, her mouth wide open in a silent, terrified scream, looking down at her custom silk maxi dress and her $1,000 strappy sandals. She took one single step toward the water, looked at the mud-slicked wooden pilings, and physically recoiled. "My baby!" She shrieked, her voice tearing through the chaos, but she remained firmly rooted to the dry, safe planks of the deck, absolutely refusing to ruin her expensive aesthetic to save her own flesh and blood. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I dove headfirst into the dark water, my yellow sundress tangling heavily around my legs as the violent shock of the cold lake enveloped me. The water was completely opaque, thick with silt and algae kicked up by the motorized boats. I opened my eyes in the murky darkness, fighting the harsh sting and fighting the blinding panic that threatened to cloud my clinical focus. I swept my arms through the dense, heavy water, kicking my legs hard to propel myself deeper beneath the massive shadow of the pontoon boat. My hand brushed against something soft. Fabric. I grabbed a desperate fistful of the red swim trunks and pulled upward with every ounce of adrenaline-fueled strength in my body. I broke the surface, gasping for the humid Georgia air, and immediately wrapped my arm tightly around Leo's tiny chest. He was frighteningly limp. His small head rolled backward against my shoulder with the dead, terrible weight of a rag doll. "Help me pull him up," I roared at the crowd of completely useless adults standing on the dock. My brother Darius finally snapped out of his paralyzed shock, dropping his glass of expensive champagne to grab my forearm, hauling both me and his lifeless son onto the hard wooden planks. I laid Leo flat on his back. The entire world around me narrowed down to a tiny, hyper-focused tunnel. The blaring music, the hysterical sobbing of my aunts, the frantic prayers of my cousins, it all faded into a dull, distant white noise. All that existed was the boy in front of me. His lips were a terrifying, unnatural shade of cyanotic blue. His skin was incredibly pale and completely devoid of warmth. I tilted his head back slightly, lifting his chin to open his airway, putting my ear close to his mouth, while intently watching his small chest. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, nothing. There was no breath, there was no rise and fall of his lungs. I pressed 2 fingers firmly to his carotid artery. The pulse was completely absent. He was in full cardiac arrest. I immediately locked my hands together, placing the heel of my palm squarely on the lower half of his tiny sternum. I locked my elbows, positioned my shoulders directly over his chest, and began chest compressions. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. I counted out loud, my voice sharp, cold, and entirely devoid of the blind panic that was currently consuming my family. I pushed down hard, compressing his chest the required 2 inches, meticulously maintaining the relentless rhythm of 100 to 120 beats per minute. That was when the physical assault began. Chloe suddenly lunged forward, dropping to her knees beside me and grabbing my wet shoulder with her sharp manicured nails. "Stop it!" she screamed right in my ear, her hot, frantic breath hitting my wet face. "Stop hitting him! You do not know what you are doing. You are going to break my son's ribs. Let him go." I shoved her hand away with a violent, forceful jerk of my elbow, never once breaking the steady rhythm of my compressions. 30 compressions, 2 rescue breaths. I pinched his small nose closed, sealed my lips over his mouth, and breathed deeply into his lungs, watching carefully for the chest rise. Then I went right back to the compressions, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and 3 and— "Get away from my child!" Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking into pure, unadulterated hysteria as she tried to physically wedge herself between me and Leo. "Darius, make her stop. She is just a dropout. She is a failed nursing student. She does not know anything about medicine. She is going to kill him." My mother Brenda threw herself onto the wet dock next to Chloe, grabbing my upper arm and trying to physically drag me away from the dying child. "Get your hands off your nephew, Jakina," my mother yelled, her voice filled with exactly the same disgust she used when scolding me for tracking mud into her pristine kitchen. "You heard your sister-in-law. You dropped out of that community college program 8 years ago because you could not handle the stress. You are just a glorified receptionist at a dirty street clinic. You are not a real doctor. Do not you dare play pretend medical expert on my grandson." I completely ignored the sharp pain of my mother's fingernails digging deeply into my bicep. I ignored the absolute absurdity of their aggressive ignorance. They had spent 8 years actively convincing themselves I was a pathetic failure because it perfectly fit their twisted elitist narrative. They had absolutely no idea that I had left that basic nursing program because Johns Hopkins University had recruited me directly into their accelerated doctoral program with a full-ride scholarship. They had no idea that my hands, the very hands they were currently trying to swat away, had performed open-heart massages in the most intense pediatric trauma bay on the entire East Coast. All they saw was the family scapegoat acting out of turn and ruining their aesthetic party. "If you touch me again, I swear to God I will have you arrested for interfering with a medical resuscitation." I barked my voice, dropping to a terrifying guttural pitch that made both my mother and Chloe freeze in absolute shock. "Someone call 911 right now and tell them we have a pediatric drowning victim receiving active CPR." I did not look up to see who made the call. I just kept pumping. My soaking wet dress clung heavily to my skin. The brutal Georgia heat beat down on my back, mixing with the cold lake water dripping from my hair. The physical exhaustion of performing continuous CPR is brutal. It burns your shoulders and sets your lower back on fire, but you do not stop. You never stop. You become a living machine, forcefully keeping the blood flowing to the brain when the heart forgets how to do its job. I could feel the fragile cartilage of his rib cage shifting under my palms. It is a terrifying sensation for a civilian, which is exactly why Chloe was currently weeping uncontrollably into my mother's shoulder, wailing about how I was butchering her perfect child. But to a highly trained professional, it is the simple mechanical reality of saving a human life. I completed the 3rd cycle of compressions and leaned down for the rescue breaths. As I pulled my mouth away, a sudden, violent spasm racked Leo's tiny frame. His chest heaved upward. Lake water spewed from his blue lips, mixing with a thick, foamy vomit. I instantly rolled him onto his side into the recovery position, sweeping his mouth clear, just as he took a massive, shuddering gasp of air. He coughed violently, his entire body shaking as oxygen finally flooded back into his deprived lungs. The awful cyanotic blue color began to fade from his cheeks, quickly replaced by a flushed, angry red. Then came the most beautiful sound in the entire world. A loud, piercing, furious wail of a terrified toddler. He was crying. He was breathing. He was alive. I slumped back onto my heels, my chest heaving, wiping the mixture of dirty lake water and sweat from my eyes. The sound of distant sirens suddenly cut through the air, growing rapidly louder as they approached the front gates of the lake property. The flashing red and white lights reflected off the surface of the water as two paramedics sprinted down the long wooden dock, carrying their heavy trauma bags. "Over here," my brother Darius yelled, waving his arms frantically at the approaching emergency medical technicians. But before the paramedics could even kneel down to assess the crying boy, Chloe swooped in like a bird of prey. She pushed me hard in the chest, knocking me off balance as she snatched Leo up from the wooden planks, clutching him tightly against her ruined silk dress. The boy wailed louder, traumatized by the sudden rough movement. "Ma'am, we need to assess the child," the lead paramedic said, setting down his heavy bag and reaching for his stethoscope. "He suffered a submersion injury and needs immediate oxygen and transport to the hospital." "I know he needs transport!" Chloe screamed, stepping back from the paramedic and pointing a furious, shaking finger directly at my face. "But you need to call the police first. I want this woman arrested right now." The paramedic looked completely baffled, his eyes darting between my soaking wet sundress and Chloe's hysterical face. "Arrested?" he asked, his voice thick with confusion. "For what?" Chloe pulled Leo tighter against her chest, her eyes blazing with a toxic mix of entitlement and pure unadulterated venom. "She just tried to murder my son." Chloe yelled, her voice echoing across the silent lake. "She is an uneducated dropout who thinks she is a nurse." She threw herself on top of my baby and started pressing as hard as she could on his chest, trying to break his ribs. She deliberately tried to kill him because she is bitter and jealous of our family. I remained sitting on the wet wooden planks, staring up at my sister-in-law in absolute silence. I had just pulled her only child back from the absolute brink of death, utilizing years of grueling medical expertise, and her first instinct was to weaponize her own ignorance to destroy me. She wanted to throw me in the back of a police car, just to protect her own fragile, arrogant ego. I slowly stood up, water dripping from the hem of my dress, and looked at the paramedic. My expression was perfectly blank, betraying absolutely none of the storm raging inside me. "Let them take him to the hospital," I thought to myself, watching the paramedic gently coax the boy from her arms. Let them play their twisted little game of superiority. Because the hospital they were heading to was my hospital. And this fake, pathetic empire they had built was about to come crashing down. The harsh, sterile fluorescent lights of the Atlanta Central Hospital emergency room waiting area buzzed with a low, irritating hum that mirrored the pounding headache building behind my eyes. The temperature inside the building was freezing, a sharp and jarring contrast to the suffocating Georgia heat we had just left behind at the lake. I sat completely isolated in the far corner of the crowded room, my yellow sundress still damp and clinging uncomfortably to my legs, smelling faintly of algae and chlorine. Across the sea of uncomfortable vinyl chairs and coughing patients, my family had formed a tight, impenetrable barricade of absolute hostility. They huddled together near the triage double doors, shooting me glares so entirely filled with venom, you would think I was an infamous serial killer waiting to be booked into county lockup, rather than the only person who had actually moved a muscle to save a drowning toddler. Chloe was currently putting on the performance of a lifetime for the sympathetic intake nurses. She draped her ruined silk maxi dress across a plastic chair, sobbing loudly and dramatically into her manicured hands, ensuring that absolutely everyone in the busy waiting room knew she was the deeply traumatized victim of this holiday tragedy. My mother stood right beside her, rubbing her daughter-in-law's shaking back with exaggerated performative affection while shooting literal daggers in my direction. The heavy, suffocating isolation they tried to force onto me was entirely intentional. It was their favorite family tactic. Whenever someone stepped out of line, whenever someone broke the unspoken rule of worshiping at the altar of Darius, they were immediately cut off and frozen out. They wanted me to feel small. They wanted me to sit in this hard plastic chair and tremble with anxiety, completely consumed by the fear of their collective rejection. They wanted me to break down, walk over to them, and beg for their forgiveness for ruining their perfect, wealthy aesthetic. I simply crossed my legs, leaned back against the hard vinyl chair, and watched them with the quiet, clinical detachment of a scientist observing a highly predictable experiment. Suddenly, Darius broke away from the huddle. His expensive linen shirt was completely wrinkled, his designer loafers squeaking loudly against the polished linoleum floor, as he marched directly toward me. His face was a dark, storming mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He did not look like a concerned father who had just nearly lost his only child. He looked like a man whose massive, fragile ego had been publicly challenged, and he was ready to completely destroy whoever was responsible. He stopped inches from my chair, towering over me, to establish physical dominance, his chest heaving with aggressive, ragged breaths. "My lawyer is already on his way!" Darius spat, his voice a harsh, guttural whisper designed to threaten and intimidate without drawing the attention of the hospital security guards standing by the entrance. "You laid your hands on my son, Jakina. You violently assaulted my boy because you could not handle Chloe putting you in your place at the party." I looked up at him, my expression perfectly blank. "Your son was in full cardiac arrest, Darius. He had no pulse. He was not breathing. I performed standard life-saving cardiopulmonary resuscitation." "Do not use your fake medical jargon with me," he hissed, leaning down so his face was inches from mine, his finger jabbing violently through the air toward my eyes. "You are a clinically untrained dropout. You have absolutely no idea what you are doing. You cracked his ribs. You practically crushed his chest. You practiced medicine without a license on my son's body, and I will personally see to it that you are thrown in a jail cell for the rest of your miserable life. I am pressing full criminal charges the second my legal team walks through those automatic sliding doors." The sheer blinding arrogance of his threat was actually breathtaking. He was completely detached from reality, so deeply brainwashed by his own mother's constant praise that he truly believed he could dictate the law, medicine, and reality itself simply by raising his voice. He honestly thought he could send me to prison for pulling his child from the jaws of death. I let a slow, chilling half-smile spread across my face. The chaotic noise of the busy emergency room waiting area seemed to fade entirely into the background. My focus narrowed exclusively onto my brother's sweating, furious face. "You really need to focus on calling a bankruptcy lawyer instead," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the sharp, undeniable weight of an absolute fact. Darius physically flinched, stepping backward as if I had shoved him in the chest. The confident, threatening posture vanished for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flash of genuine, wide-eyed panic before the familiar toxic rage violently swallowed it back up. He completely lost his mind. "Do not bring your pathetic, broke jealousy into this," Darius snarled, his voice rising in volume, no longer caring who in the waiting room heard him. "Do not you dare project your poverty mindset into my tax bracket. I am a CEO. I run a highly successful real estate empire. I have a platinum health insurance policy that covers the absolute best medical care in this entire state. I have the best legal team in the entire city of Atlanta on retainer, and they will absolutely bury you. You are nothing but a bitter minimum wage clinic worker who cannot stand to see Black excellence thriving right in front of your face. You have been a miserable, toxic failure since the day you quit school, and you tried to take it out on my family today." His loud, aggressive rant was meant to put me in my place, to loudly remind me of the family hierarchy where he sat firmly on the golden throne. The irony was so thick I could practically taste it. He was standing in the middle of a public emergency room, wearing a wrinkled luxury shirt, bought on credit, screaming about Black excellence, while drowning in predatory high-interest commercial loans that were weeks away from defaulting. He was flexing a fake platinum insurance card that had likely been declined at the registration desk 10 minutes ago. Before I could verbally dismantle his pathetic CEO speech, the sharp, rapid clicking of heels hitting the linoleum announced the arrival of the ultimate enabler. My mother, Brenda, marched across the waiting room, her jaw set in a rigid line of absolute maternal fury. In her hand, she tightly clutched a thick stack of hospital registration paperwork attached to a plastic clipboard. She shoved her way past a bewildered-looking patient and stopped right next to Darius, instantly forming a physical wall of defense in front of her golden boy. "Leave your brother alone," she demanded, glaring down at me with a look of such profound disgust it actually defied logic. "He is going through the worst day of his life, and you are sitting here harassing him. He is building an empire to support this family, and you have been a dark, heavy cloud over our heads since the day you quit your nursing program and ran away like a coward. You have always been jealous of his success. Always. I did not break eye contact with her. I did not raise my voice. I am not harassing anyone, Mother. I am simply sitting here waiting for an update on the patient I resuscitated. You did not resuscitate anyone, she yelled, pointing the hard edge of the clipboard at my face. You attacked him. You almost killed my grandson because you wanted to prove some sick point to Chloe. And now you are going to pay the ultimate price for your jealous, destructive behavior. She took the heavy stack of hospital paperwork from the clipboard and violently threw it directly at my chest. The papers fluttered wildly in the air before landing heavily in my lap. The top page was a brightly colored emergency room admission form, and bold black ink highlighted a massive, terrifying number at the very bottom of the page. They want a deposit, Brenda sneered, crossing her arms over her chest with a look of absolute triumphant vindication. $25,000, right now. Chloe's primary insurance card did not go through the hospital system. It is obviously a computer glitch in their outdated billing department because my son is a millionaire and his coverage is flawless. But the hospital is refusing to move Leo up to a private VIP pediatric recovery suite until that temporary deposit is cleared. She leaned down, her face contorted with a vicious, toxic delight. Because you caused this entire scene because you violently assaulted my grandson and dragged us to this public hospital instead of a private clinic, you are going to take responsibility for once in your miserable life. Because you put that boy in the hospital, you are going to pay this $25,000 bill. I picked up the heavy stack of papers, feeling the thick, crisp hospital cardstock between my damp fingers. I did not gasp. I did not burst into tears. I did not scramble to pull out my purse and beg for a payment plan like they so desperately wanted me to do. Instead, I carefully adjusted the papers, smoothing out the crumpled edges where my mother had gripped them so violently. I took my absolute time, letting the suffocating silence stretch out between us in that freezing waiting room. Darius crossed his arms over his chest, puffing himself up, waiting for my inevitable surrender. Chloe sniffled loudly, wiping away a non-existent tear, completely ready to watch me be financially ruined. I let my eyes scan the standardized intake form. I knew these exact forms better than the back of my own hand. I knew exactly where to look for the billing codes, the triage notes, and the financial liability clauses. My eyes bypassed the massive $25,000 figure at the bottom and landed squarely on the top right corner. There, stamped in bold, unmistakable red ink, were two words that completely dismantled my brother's entire fake reality. Insurance denied. I slowly looked up from the plastic clipboard. I bypassed my mother's furious red face and locked eyes directly with Darius. He was still trying to maintain his aggressive, intimidating posture, but I could see a tiny, frantic muscle twitching wildly in his jaw. His confidence was a thin, fragile veneer, and he knew I was holding the sledgehammer. I am just a little confused, I said, my voice dangerously level, echoing clearly over the dull hum of the hospital vending machines and the coughing patients nearby. I tapped my index finger right on the red ink. I thought the incredibly successful CEO of a real estate empire had a flawless platinum health insurance policy. I thought you had the absolute best medical coverage in the entire state of Georgia. Darius swallowed hard. The warm color began to drain from his face, leaving a sickly ashen undertone beneath his skin. It is obviously a mistake, he stammered, his voice suddenly losing all of its previous booming authority. These public hospitals are a complete mess. Their administrative staff is incompetent. They probably typed the policy group number in wrong. I shook my head, letting a cold, mocking smile touch my lips. No, Darius. They did not type the number in wrong. This billing software is actually state-of-the-art. It links directly to the National Provider Database in real time. I held the clipboard up, so the harsh fluorescent lights illuminated the stark black text underneath the red stamp. I pointed directly to the small computerized printout code. It says right here in plain English, coverage terminated due to separation of employment. And look at the date of termination, Darius. It was exactly 4 months ago. The words hit the small, isolated corner of the waiting room like a live grenade. The silence that followed was so absolute, so incredibly heavy, that I could actually hear the erratic, shallow breathing of my sister-in-law. Chloe slowly turned her head to look at her husband. The performative sobbing victim routine completely vanished from her face, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. The heavy designer makeup she wore could not hide the sudden, stark terror widening her eyes. Separation of employment. Chloe repeated, her voice trembling, dropping to a harsh, strained whisper. Darius, what is she talking about? What does that mean? Darius took a panicked step back, raising his hands defensively toward his wife. Chloe, baby, do not listen to her. She is just trying to start drama because she is in trouble. You know how she is. She is lying. I am reading directly from the hospital's verified intake form. I countered effortlessly, my voice cutting through his pathetic lies like a surgical scalpel. I flipped to the second page, scanning the secondary guarantor information. You do not have corporate insurance, Darius. You do not have Cobra. You have absolutely nothing. You brought your dying son into a major trauma center, demanding private VIP recovery suites, handing them a piece of plastic that has been dead and useless for a third of a year. Chloe grabbed the sleeve of Darius's wrinkled linen shirt, her manicured nails digging fiercely into the fabric. You told me you were expanding the firm, she shrieked, her voice cracking as the carefully constructed illusion of her billionaire lifestyle began to shatter into a million irreparable pieces. You told me you were traveling to Miami and Chicago for the last 4 months to open new commercial branches. You told me the board of directors gave you a massive expansion budget. Were you fired? Darius, look at me. Were you fired from the firm? The golden boy of the family, the undisputed king of our toxic dynamic, completely folded. He started sweating profusely, heavy droplets forming on his forehead and upper lip. He looked around the waiting room like a trapped animal desperately searching for an exit that simply did not exist. Chloe, we can talk about this at home, he begged, his voice high-pitched and whining. We have some liquidity issues, that is all. The market is transitioning. I am just restructuring my portfolio. Please, just calm down. He was drowning and he knew it. He had funded his luxury lake house, his wife's Gucci bags, and his fake CEO persona with a dangerous high-interest commercial loan, masking the fact that he was an unemployed fraud living entirely on borrowed time and stolen credit. And now, standing in the harsh, unforgiving light of the emergency room, the massive bill had finally come due. But before Chloe could unleash the full, terrifying extent of her materialistic wrath onto her husband, the ultimate enabler threw herself directly into the line of fire. My mother, Brenda, violently snatched the clipboard out of my hands, her chest heaving with a desperate, blind fury. She stared at the yellow paper, her eyes skimming over the red denial stamp, but her brain completely refused to process the reality written in front of her. She could not accept it. She would rather watch the entire world burn to ash than admit her perfect golden son was a complete failure. This is a lie, my mother screamed, waving the clipboard wildly in the air. Her voice echoed off the sterile walls, causing several nurses at the intake desk to stand up and look in our direction. It is a computer error. These machines make mistakes all the time. My son is a highly successful executive. He owns a lake house. He drives a luxury car. Do not you dare stand there and try to humiliate him with some broken hospital paperwork. I looked at my mother, feeling a profound, chilling sense of pity mixed with absolute disgust. You are holding the undeniable proof right in your hands, Mother, I said calmly. Your son is broke. He has no insurance. He cannot even afford to pay the emergency room deposit for his own child's medical care. That is why they handed this bill to you. They know he is a massive financial liability. Shut up, she shrieked, taking a menacing step toward me, raising the plastic clipboard as if she was going to bash me over the head with it. You are a toxic, jealous liar, Jakina. You hacked into their system, did not you? You used your pathetic little clinic clearance to mess with his file just to embarrass him. You are trying to ruin his marriage. You are trying to destroy his reputation because you will never ever be half the person he is. The sheer absurdity of her accusation was staggering. She honestly believed I had the time, the high-level administrative access, or the petty desire to orchestrate a massive cyber attack on a hospital's billing department while simultaneously performing CPR on her grandson. Her delusion was a heavily armored fortress, completely impenetrable by facts, logic, or basic human reality. You are going to pay this $25,000. My mother continued to rage, her face inches from mine, spitting her vicious words with terrifying intensity. You caused this mess. You put Leo in a hospital bed with your violent, uneducated assault. You will drain your bank account. You will take out a loan. You will do whatever it takes to fix this, or I swear to God, I will personally ensure you are locked in a prison cell. I smoothed down the damp fabric of my sundress, completely unbothered by her screaming. I am not paying a single dime for your son's fake lifestyle, I replied, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal authority. And nobody is going to prison. In fact, if you do not lower your voice and step back right now, the only person leaving this building in handcuffs will be you for creating a hostile disturbance in an active trauma center. My mother opened her mouth to scream another vicious threat, her eyes wide with unhinged malice, but the words died instantly in her throat. From the far end of the waiting room, the heavy frosted glass double doors of the VIP Pediatric Intensive Care Unit suddenly burst open with a loud mechanical hiss. The sound was sharp and authoritative, immediately cutting through the ambient noise of the emergency department. I looked past my mother's trembling shoulder. Striding purposefully through the doors was Dr. Washington, the chief of medicine and the absolute highest-ranking medical authority in the entire hospital network. He was flanked by two senior attending trauma surgeons, their pristine white coats billowing slightly as they moved with an urgent, undeniable sense of purpose. Dr. Washington's face was a mask of intense, serious concentration. He bypassed the main intake desk, completely ignoring the administrative staff who immediately stood at attention as he passed. His sharp, commanding gaze swept over the crowded waiting room, dismissing the sea of waiting patients until his eyes locked directly onto our isolated, highly tense corner. He did not hesitate. He did not slow down. With the two senior doctors trailing right behind him, the chief of medicine marched in a direct, unswerving line straight toward me. The sound was sharp and commanding, instantly drawing the eyes of every frantic patient, tired nurse, and security guard in the room. The sterile fluorescent lights overhead seemed to buzz with a sudden heightened electric intensity as three prominent medical figures strode purposefully through the doorway. Dr. Washington, the chief of medicine and the absolute highest-ranking authority in the entire hospital network, led the charge. He was flanked closely by two senior attending trauma surgeons, their pristine white medical coats billowing slightly around their knees as they moved with an urgent, undeniable sense of profound purpose. Chloe saw the white coats approaching, and her entire demeanor shifted in the blink of an eye. The pathetic weeping victim routine vanished completely, instantly replaced by the arrogant, highly entitled mask of a wealthy suburban socialite. She completely ignored the unpaid $25,000 admission bill lying on my lap and shoved her way forward, practically sprinting across the scuffed linoleum floor. She aggressively adjusted the neckline of her ruined wet silk dress, throwing her shoulders back as she stepped directly into the chief of medicine's path, forcing the three men to halt. "Oh, thank goodness you are finally here to take charge of this disaster," Chloe announced, her voice dripping with an exaggerated, breathy relief designed to capture the attention of everyone in the immediate vicinity. "I am Chloe. We are the VIP family you were called about regarding the pediatric drowning. My husband Darius is a highly successful executive CEO in Atlanta, and we absolutely demand that our son Leo be moved to a private luxury pediatric recovery suite immediately. We have been forced to wait in this dreadful, unsanitary public area for nearly 20 minutes surrounded by common criminals, and we simply will not tolerate this level of sheer incompetence any longer. We are fully prepared to make a massive tax-deductible donation to this hospital if you can just get us away from these horrible people and arrest the woman who assaulted my baby." Dr. Washington did not even blink. He did not offer a polite, accommodating nod. He did not offer a comforting professional smile. He simply stepped around Chloe as if she were a discarded plastic waiting room chair, blocking a fire exit. His two senior attending surgeons followed suit in perfect synchronization, completely ignoring her aggressively outstretched hand and her indignant open-mouthed gasp. Chloe stumbled backward in her expensive muddy sandals, her face flushing a deep, violently humiliating shade of crimson, as the highest-ranking medical professional in the building entirely dismissed her existence. Dr. Washington marched straight past the furious huddle of my relatives and headed directly toward the isolated, freezing corner where I sat. As he stopped in front of my hard plastic chair, the visual perspective in the room seemed to shift dramatically. The invisible, toxic hierarchy my family had violently enforced for decades shattered into a million irreparable pieces in the span of 5 seconds. From my seated position, looking up at the imposing authoritative figure of the chief of medicine, I watched him do something that made my mother actually stop breathing. He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of profound, undeniable professional respect that he reserved only for his absolute equals. "Dr. Washington," he said, his deep, resonant voice carrying clearly over the dead silence of the crowded waiting room. "Why on earth is our head of pediatric emergency and our lead trauma specialist sitting out here in the public waiting area like a civilian?" The silence that instantly blanketed the room was absolute and suffocating. It was a thick, heavy quiet that made the distant sirens outside sound like they were miles away. My mother Brenda dropped her designer handbag. It hit the floor with a loud, unceremonious thud, spilling her expensive cosmetics car keys and loose change across the scuffed tiles. Darius took a sharp physical step backward, bumping hard into a row of empty chairs, his eyes wide bloodshot and completely unfocused. Chloe stood perfectly still, her manicured hands frozen in mid-air, her jaw practically unhinged as she stared at the man who had just addressed me. Dr. Washington did not seem to notice or care about the sheer paralyzing terror radiating from my relatives. He kept his eyes entirely focused on me, his expression softening into a look of absolute, unwavering professional admiration. "The emergency medical technicians just gave me the full detailed field report from the lake incident." He continued, his words acting as a massive wrecking ball against my family's fabricated reality. "Your response time and your chest compression technique were utterly flawless. You managed to stabilize a full pediatric cardiac arrest in a highly contaminated, non-sterile environment with absolutely zero medical equipment or backup. You saved that boy's life today, Jakina. We have him fully stabilized in the intensive care unit right now, and his attending physician specifically noted in the official chart that your immediate expert intervention is the only reason he did not suffer catastrophic permanent brain damage." Brenda began to shake violently. The matriarch of the family, the woman who had spent the last hour violently screaming that I was an uneducated, jealous failure who was trying to murder her grandson, looked as though she was actively choking on her own tongue. She pointed a violently trembling finger at Dr. Washington, then at me, her face pale, sweating, and entirely drained of its former aggressive color. Dr. Brenda stammered, her voice a weak, pathetic wheeze that sounded absolutely nothing like her usual commanding bark. "Head of Pediatric Emergency, Trauma Specialist. There must be some massive, ridiculous mistake here. She is not a doctor. She is a dropout. She failed out of her basic community college nursing program 8 years ago. She scrapes rust off trays at a free clinic. She cannot possibly be a surgeon." I did not rush to answer her. I let her marinate in the agonizing, extremely public humiliation of her own profound ignorance. Behind Dr. Washington, a young, exhausted-looking triage nurse hurried forward, carrying a crisp, heavily starched white medical coat on a wooden hanger. She handed it to me, with a deeply respectful nod, her eyes darting nervously toward my hyperventilating mother. I slowly stood up from the hard vinyl chair. I took the $25,000 emergency room bill, folded it precisely in half along the crease, and placed it neatly onto the empty seat. Then, with deliberate, unhurried grace, I slipped my arms into the sleeves of the white coat. The bold navy blue embroidery on the left breast pocket caught the harsh hospital fluorescent lighting, broadcasting the undeniable truth to the entire room. It read, Dr. Jakina Washington, MD, PhD, Head of Pediatric Trauma. I looked down at my mother, calmly adjusting the pristine lapels of the heavy coat. The transition was completely finalized. The damp, isolated girl in the ruined yellow sundress was gone permanently, replaced by the highest-ranking pediatric trauma surgeon in the building. I dropped out of the community college nursing program 8 years ago, Mother. I said, my voice carrying a cold, clinical precision that left absolutely no room for argument, negotiation, or denial. I dropped out because the admissions committee at Johns Hopkins University Medical School recruited me directly into their highly exclusive accelerated dual-degree doctoral program. They offered me a full-ride merit-based scholarship that covered every single dime of my tuition, housing, and international research grants. I took a slow, measured step forward, forcing my mother to physically retreat until her back hit the cold concrete wall of the waiting room. You would have known that I continued, my voice steady, powerful, and completely devoid of any the emotional desperation I used to feel as a child. You would have known that if you had ever bothered to ask why I was moving to Baltimore. You would have known I was graduating at the absolute top of my medical class if you had ever picked up the phone to call me on a holiday. But you did not ask. You did not care. You were entirely too busy organizing a lavish catered neighborhood block party to celebrate Darius buying a base model Porsche on a high-interest 96-month financing plan. You desperately needed a failure to make his mediocre debt-fueled life look like a raging billionaire success. So I simply let you believe exactly what you wanted to believe. It kept you out of my bank accounts, and it kept your toxic, exhausting, endless drama entirely out of my operating room. Darius let out a choked, frantic gasp, his hands desperately grabbing the sides of his head as he stared at the shiny blue embroidery on my white coat. The realization of my actual income, my genuine, highly respected status, and my completely undeniable power within this massive hospital system was visibly short-circuiting his brain. He had just threatened to sue the head of pediatric trauma for saving his son's life. Chloe was completely hyperventilating, her chest heaving, as her eyes darted frantically between my crisp white coat and the unpaid, financially devastating hospital bill sitting on the chair. They had spent the entire afternoon trying to destroy me, trying to send me to a state prison cell, trying to violently force me to pay for their fake plastic lifestyle. The truth was entirely brutally exposed. The grand, magnificent illusion of their generational wealth was completely shattered, replaced by the undeniable, rock-solid reality of my actual earned empire. In a normal, healthy family, this absolute devastating revelation would bring immediate tears of shame. It would bring profound, groveling apologies and a desperate, tearful desire to make amends for a decade of horrific, unforgivable psychological abuse. But as I watched the initial shock slowly fade from my mother's dark eyes, I did not see a single ounce of guilt. I did not see any remorse, sadness, or shame for physically attacking me for insulting my intelligence, or for blatantly lying to the entire extended family. Instead, as Brenda looked at my pristine white coat and then at Darius's panicked, sweaty face, her eyes narrowed with a sharp, terrifying new calculation. The color returned to her cheeks, not with embarrassment, but with a sudden predatory hunger. The reality of my immense wealth and institutional power had finally registered in her mind, and rather than pushing her away in shame, it activated a level of toxic, consuming greed that went far beyond anything I could have ever anticipated. The absolute silence in the emergency room waiting area was a living, breathing entity. It was thick, heavy, and suffocating, pressing down on my family, as the undeniable reality of my position finally shattered their carefully constructed delusions. I stood there in my crisp white coat, the gold embroidery gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, and watched the realization wash over my mother's face. I tracked the exact microscopic movements of her features as her brain furiously recalculated the entire power dynamic of our relationship. The visceral hatred and embarrassment that had contorted her face just seconds ago miraculously vanished. It was replaced by something far more insidious, a sickening predatory gleam that made my stomach churn. She was looking at the undeniable proof of my medical authority and massive income, not with maternal pride, but as if she were staring at a winning lottery ticket. The sheer, terrifying speed with which she abandoned her violent outrage to embrace naked, opportunistic greed was a masterclass in narcissistic survival. But before my mother could even formulate a suitably manipulative sentence to bridge the massive gap she had just created, Chloe completely broke ranks. The profound, blinding arrogance that had fueled her hysterical demands to have me arrested for murder evaporated into the sterile hospital air. Her eyes darted wildly from the massive $25,000 admission bill resting on the plastic chair to the crisp white lapels draped across my shoulders. You could literally see the desperate, frantic gears grinding in her head. She was a woman who worshipped status, institutional power, and money above absolutely all else, and she had just realized she had spent the last 5 years viciously degrading the most powerful, wealthy person in her immediate orbit. More importantly, she realized her husband was completely broke. His credit was fraudulent, and the only person standing between her and a $25,000 medical debt collection was the very woman she had just tried to send to prison. Suddenly, the screeching, accusatory banshee was gone. Chloe forcefully shoved her damp, tangled blonde hair behind her ears and pasted on a smile so entirely fake, so intensely forced, that it looked physically painful. Her entire posture changed, hunching slightly to appear smaller, less threatening, and entirely submissive. She stepped forward, her expensive muddy sandals squelching loudly against the polished linoleum floor, completely ignoring the fact that Dr. Washington and his senior trauma surgeons were standing right there observing this entire pathetic spectacle. "Oh, my sweet sister-in-law!" Chloe practically cooed, her voice jumping 2 octaves into a sickeningly sweet, breathy register that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. She closed the physical distance between us in a flash, reaching out with both of her shaking hands to desperately grab my fingers. Her palms were clammy and cold. "I knew there was a reason you were so incredibly calm at the lake. This is actually perfect. I am so incredibly relieved. Since you are the head of the department here, you can just tell the intake nurses to move our little Leo up to the absolute best VIP suite right now. You know, the private ones on the top floor with the good views. And obviously you can just use your authority to wipe out this ridiculous $25,000 bill, right? I mean, it is just a silly administrative error with our insurance anyway, but you can just make it completely disappear for family. We would appreciate it so much, Jakina." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her request hung in the freezing air. Less than 20 minutes ago, she was screaming at the top of her lungs that I was an uneducated dropout who had violently assaulted her child. She had actively demanded that the paramedics call the police to have me arrested for attempted murder. And now, standing in the shadow of my massive institutional authority, she was holding my hands and batting her eyelashes, expecting me to magically erase her husband's humiliating financial ruin with the wave of a pen. I looked down at her pale, trembling hands gripping mine. A wave of profound, visceral disgust washed over me. I violently ripped my hands out of her grasp, jerking my arms back as if I had just been touched by toxic, infectious medical waste. Chloe stumbled forward slightly, letting out a sharp, pathetic gasp as she lost her balance. "Do not touch me," I said, my voice dropping to a low, glacial register that echoed clearly across the silent waiting room. The intake nurses at the main desk had completely stopped typing, their eyes wide as they watched the incredibly wealthy, entitled woman grovel at my feet. "You want me to magically erase your massive debt, Chloe?" I tilted my head, looking down at her with absolute, unshielded contempt. "Did not you just call me a failed black girl who is dirtying up your pristine luxury pool? Did not you just scream in front of our entire extended family that I was a bitter, pathetic loser who belonged at the absolute bottom of the social ladder?" I took a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing her to retreat. "Is the memory of the elite white upper crust really that incredibly short? Or do your racist, classist insults magically disappear the exact second you realize you are too broke to afford your own child's emergency medical care? Chloe's jaw dropped open. Her face drained of all color, turning an ashen, sickly white under the fluorescent lights. She looked completely, utterly destroyed, stripped of her designer armor, and exposed for the shallow, opportunistic fraud she truly was. She opened her mouth to stutter out a pathetic defense, but no sound came out. She just stared at me, her eyes wide with the horrifying realization that her usual manipulations were completely useless here. I owned this space. I held all the cards and I was entirely immune to her fake, tearful pleading. Before Chloe could collapse into a puddle of genuine panicked tears, heavy aggressive footsteps pounded against the linoleum. Darius shoved his way past his completely paralyzed wife, his face contorted into a mask of explosive, unchecked rage. His fragile, massive ego simply could not handle watching his wife be publicly humiliated and mathematically dismantled by the younger sister he had spent his entire life looking down upon. If he could not control the situation with his fake wealth, he was going to try to control it with brute force. He threw his shoulders back, puffing out his chest as he stepped directly into my personal space, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me just like he did when we were children. The veins in his thick neck were bulging, pulsing rapidly with toxic adrenaline. "You listen to me right now, Jakina!" Darius roared, his voice booming through the emergency department, causing a nearby security guard to instinctively place a hand on his radio. "I do not care what kind of fancy white coat you are wearing, and I do not care what your title is in this building. You are still my younger sister, and you owe this family. We took care of you. Mom took care of you. I am the man of this family, and I am telling you to fix this right now. You are going to go over to that billing desk, you are going to clear that $25,000 charge, and you are going to get my son into a private room. It is your absolute family duty to protect us. Do not you dare stand there and disrespect your own blood because you finally got a little bit of power. You will do your job and you will protect this family's name." His aggressive, demanding roar echoed off the high ceilings, but it did not make me flinch. It did not make me cower, and it certainly did not make me feel a single ounce of familial obligation. His desperate attempt to re-establish dominance was so transparently pathetic that it was actually painful to watch. He was a drowning man screaming at the lifeguard to apologize for getting his clothes wet. I did not step back. I did not break eye contact. I let his furious, booming echo fade into complete, dead silence. I looked at the sweat dripping down his temples, at the absolute terror hiding just behind his aggressive, bulging eyes. He knew he was ruined. He knew his creditors were coming, his fake empire was collapsing, and this hospital bill was the final nail in the coffin of his manufactured life. "I am not your personal bank account, Darius," I said quietly, my voice slicing through his remaining bravado with surgical precision. "And I am certainly not your shield. You built a life entirely on lies, high-interest loans, and the constant vicious degradation of anyone you deemed beneath you. And now the bill is simply past due." I slowly turned my head away from his furious, shaking face and looked toward the main triage station. I made a sharp, subtle gesture with my hand. A senior charge nurse who had been watching the entire confrontation with a look of absolute silent solidarity immediately stepped out from behind the protective glass counter. She walked swiftly across the waiting room floor, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking softly, and stopped directly beside me. In her hands, she held a sleek silver clinical iPad, the screen glowing brightly with the hospital's internal database. I took the iPad from her hands, the cool metal grounding me in the reality of my absolute authority. My family watched the device with wide, terrified eyes, completely unsure of what fresh nightmare I was about to unleash upon their fragile, crumbling world. I looked back at Darius, my finger hovering deliberately over the glowing digital screen. The soft, ambient blue light from the hospital tablet reflected directly onto Darius's sweating, distorted face. It highlighted every single line of stress, every pore, and the absolute paralyzing terror widening his eyes. He looked exactly like a man standing on the trapdoor of the gallows, just waiting for the lever to be pulled. In this hospital for uninsured patients demanding premium VIP services and generating massive emergency room liabilities, Our financial department ran immediate comprehensive background checks. It was standard protocol to determine if the hospital was dealing with a legitimate charity care case or someone who was simply attempting to defraud the healthcare system. I tapped the glowing screen once. The application processed the data for a fraction of a second before the comprehensive financial report populated. I did not even have to dig deep. The glaring red flags were plastered all over the very first page, screaming the truth of his pathetic existence. I kept my eyes locked onto the screen, reading the stark, unforgiving black text with the clinical detachment of a surgeon delivering a terminal diagnosis. Darius Washington. I read aloud, my voice carrying clearly through the suffocating silence of the emergency room corridor. The words felt like physical strikes against his fragile ego. Employment status terminated for cause. I paused, letting that sink in before delivering the lethal blow. And the cause of that termination is explicitly listed right here in the public legal filings attached to your financial profile. You were not just laid off, Darius. You did not step down to restructure your portfolio. You were fired by the board of directors for gross financial misconduct. You were caught actively embezzling client deposit funds from the firm's escrow accounts. Darius let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. He physically staggered backward as if I had driven a fist directly into his sternum. His knees buckled slightly, his expensive squeaky loafers skidding against the polished linoleum floor. But I was not finished. I scrolled down the screen, the blue light continuing to paint his terrified face in harsh, unforgiving shadows. Let us look at the current liabilities. I continued, my tone completely conversational, as if I were reading the weather report rather than dismantling a man's entire life. Multiple credit lines flagged for severe delinquency. 7 different premium credit cards maxed out to their absolute limits. It looks like you have accumulated exactly $150,000 in revolving high-interest consumer debt. You do not have a real estate empire. You do not have a platinum insurance policy. You do not have a single dime to your name. You are a walking, breathing financial black hole, and you do not even have the cash to pay the basic admission deposit to save your own son's life. The silence that followed was heavy, toxic, and absolutely devastating. Chloe let out a sound that resembled a dying animal. She stumbled away from her husband as if he were suddenly covered in a highly contagious disease. Her hands flew to her face, smearing her expensive foundation, as she stared at Darius with a mixture of absolute revulsion and profound horror. The designer silk dress she was wearing, the luxury SUV parked outside, the carefully curated social media posts, showcasing their flawless, wealthy, suburban life. It was all funded by stolen money. She was not the wife of a billionaire CEO. She was married to an unemployed, broke criminal who was moments away from being indicted for embezzlement. Darius. Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking violently, echoing off the high ceilings of the waiting area. Her eyes were wide, manic, and completely unhinged. Tell me she is lying. Tell me right now that this jealous, bitter woman is making this up. You told me the money from the escrow accounts was an executive bonus. You told me the firm approved the transfer to pay for my new car. Tell me you did not steal that money. Darius could not even look at his wife. He was physically shrinking, his broad shoulders curling inward, his entire posture collapsing in on itself. He looked down at the floor, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. Chloe. Baby, it is a misunderstanding. Darius stammered, his voice weak, trembling, and completely stripped of its former booming authority. The partners, they just did not understand my accounting methods. It was a temporary bridge loan. I was going to put the money back as soon as the new commercial project closed. It is just a minor cash flow issue. I swear to you, I have a plan to fix this. He reached out a shaking hand to touch her arm, but Chloe violently slapped it away. Do not touch me, she screamed, taking another massive step backward. You are broke. You are a criminal. We are going to lose everything. The house, the cars, the country club memberships. My friends are going to find out. The entire neighborhood is going to know I am married to a fraud. She was not crying for her child, who was currently lying in the intensive care unit attached to a web of life-saving monitors. She was not crying for the trauma her family had endured today. She was actively sobbing over the loss of her superficial social status. The sheer naked vanity of her grief was breathtaking to witness. Darius spun back toward me, his eyes blazing with the desperate, cornered rage of a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. He lunged forward, his hand swiping violently through the air as he tried to snatch the iPad directly out of my hands. "Give me that!" he roared, his face contorted into an ugly, vicious sneer. "You have no right to look at my private financial information. You are violating federal privacy laws. I will sue you. I will sue this entire hospital. I will have your medical license permanently revoked for this." I simply took a calm, measured step backward, easily avoiding his clumsy, desperate grasp. I held the silver tablet firmly against my chest, my expression completely unbothered by his pathetic attempt at physical intimidation. "You signed a comprehensive financial disclosure waiver. The exact second you demanded premium medical services without valid insurance," I stated coldly. "You authorized this background check yourself, and you are in absolutely no position to sue anyone, Darius. You are weeks away from facing a grand jury indictment for corporate fraud. The only lawyer you need to be calling right now is a public defender." He opened his mouth to scream another threat, but the absolute crushing reality of his situation finally seemed to break through his thick skull. His jaw snapped shut. His hands fell limply to his sides. The golden boy of the Washington family, the undeniable king of our toxic dynamic, was finally utterly destroyed. He was entirely exposed in the middle of a public hospital, stripped of his fake wealth, his fake title, and his fake superiority. But the delusion of the Washington family was a deeply ingrained, highly resilient infection. It did not die easily. Before Darius could completely collapse into a puddle of his own making, my mother threw herself violently into the center of the confrontation. Brenda shoved her way past Chloe, placing her body directly in front of Darius like a human shield. Her eyes were completely wild, blazing with a terrifying, unhinged devotion. She refused to accept reality. She refused to let the world see her perfect son as a failure. "Shut up," Brenda screamed, pointing a rigid, shaking finger directly at my face. "Shut your miserable lying mouth right now. I do not care what that stupid computer says. I do not care what lies those jealous corporate partners made up about my boy. He is a good man. He is a provider. He just made a tiny mistake because the pressure of supporting this entire family is so heavy on his shoulders." She turned slightly, wrapping her arms protectively around Darius's chest, rubbing his back with frantic, desperate affection. "Do not. You worry about a single thing, my baby," Brenda cooed, her voice dropping into a sickeningly sweet maternal register that she had never ever used with me. "Mama is right here. Mama is going to fix everything. We will take care of your brother. We will protect this family." She spun back to face me, her chin raised in an aggressive, defiant posture of absolute, unyielding superiority. "You think you have won because you put on a white coat and read some numbers off a screen?" Brenda sneered, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated venom. "You think you can destroy him just because he hit a small financial bump in the road? You are wrong. This family takes care of its own. Your father and I will pay this hospital bill. We will pay off his credit cards. We will hire the best defense attorneys in the entire state to crush these ridiculous embezzlement charges." I stared at her, genuinely fascinated by the sheer depth of her psychological illness. "How do you plan on paying for all of that, Mother?" I asked quietly. "You and Dad do not have that kind of liquid cash lying around. You spent your entire retirement fund paying for Darius's extravagant wedding and Chloe's ridiculous engagement ring." Brenda let out a sharp, triumphant laugh. Her chest puffed out with arrogant pride. "We will sell the lake house," she declared, her voice ringing clearly down the hospital corridor, bouncing off the sterile walls with absolute, unquestionable certainty. "We will put the Lake Oconee property on the market tomorrow morning. That house is worth over $1 million. It is the generational wealth of the Washington family. It is our legacy. We will sell our legacy to save our son, and we will never ever let a bitter, jealous little girl like you tear him down." She crossed her arms over her chest, staring at me with a look of absolute smug victory. She honestly believed she had played the ultimate trump card. She believed she had reestablished the family hierarchy, proving once and for all that Darius was the priority, the golden child who was worth sacrificing the entire family fortune to save. I looked at my mother's triumphant face. I looked at Darius, who was visibly sagging with relief behind her. I looked at Chloe, who was suddenly calculating how much of that $1 million house sale she could secure for herself in a divorce settlement. They were all clinging so desperately to this massive, beautiful illusion. For a moment, the entire emergency room was dead silent. The only sound was the steady rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor from a nearby trauma bay. And then I started to laugh. It did not start as a chuckle. It started deep in my chest, bubbling up through years of suppressed anger, endless humiliation, and profound, exhausting grief. It burst out of my mouth in a loud, sharp, bitter sound that shattered the heavy tension in the room. I threw my head back, the pristine white collar of my medical coat shifting against my neck, and let out a full, echoing roar of laughter. The sound was completely devoid of joy. It was harsh, metallic, and utterly devastating. The loud, continuous laughter bounced off the walls, echoing down the long, sterile corridors of the hospital, freezing my family in place as they stared at me in absolute, uncomprehending horror. My laughter stopped as abruptly as it had started. The sudden, unnatural silence that rushed back into the emergency room waiting area felt heavier than a physical weight. I handed the silver tablet back to the charge nurse, who took it with a slight, respectful nod, before stepping back to observe the absolute carnage unfolding in front of her triage desk. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the icy, sterile air of the hospital fill my lungs. The chaotic background of the emergency department seemed to blur and fade away, narrowing my entire world down to the pathetic group of people standing in front of me. I remained perfectly still, a calm, immovable center within the eye of a violent storm, and focused my gaze entirely on my mother. Her smug, triumphant smile had frozen into a mask of deep, unsettling confusion. "You cannot sell the Lake Oconee house, Mother," I said, the words slowly articulating each syllable with razor-sharp clinical precision. I watched her blink her mind, struggling to process a statement that directly contradicted her entire worldview. "Yes, I can," she snapped, her voice trembling but immediately defensive. "My name is on the deed. It is a fully paid-off asset. It is worth over $1 million. I will call the real estate agent the exact second the sun comes up tomorrow morning, and we will list it." I shook my head, feeling a cold, dark satisfaction wash over me. It was a paid-off asset, Mother. Past tense. It belonged to you right up until Darius convinced you to sign a thick stack of legal documents last year. Do you remember those papers, Brenda? The ones he told you were just standard tax restructuring forms to help him avoid corporate capital gains. The ones you signed blindly without ever bothering to consult a single lawyer because your golden boy told you it was just routine administrative paperwork. Darius let out a sound like a wounded animal. He lunged forward, trying to physically position himself between me and our mother. "Shut up!" he bellowed, his voice cracking with sheer, unadulterated panic. "Do not say another word. You have no idea what you are talking about. You are violating my privacy. I will ruin you." I did not flinch. I did not even look at him. I kept my eyes locked onto my mother's pale, sweating face, watching the dawning horror slowly creep into her eyes. "Those were not tax forms, Mother. Your son was drowning in illicit, illegal sports betting debts. He has a massive, completely out-of-control gambling addiction. He lost hundreds of thousands of dollars betting on professional basketball games, and he owed that money to people who do not operate legally. People who do not send polite collection letters in the mail. They send men to your front door to break legs. So Darius used his power of attorney and your blind, pathetic devotion to secure a massive second mortgage on the Lake Oconee house. He leveraged the entire property, borrowing against every single cent of its equity to pay off his bookies." The color entirely drained from my mother's face. Her mouth opened, but only a dry, rattling breath escaped. And the worst part is, I continued, my voice dropping to a harsh, unforgiving whisper that cut through the room like shattered glass. He did not even go through a legitimate bank. His credit was already entirely destroyed from his embezzlement schemes at the real estate firm. He went to a predatory high-interest lending group, a group of glorified loan sharks who charge exorbitant predatory interest rates. and he completely defaulted. He has not made a single payment in 6 months. The foreclosure notice was officially filed with the county clerk 3 weeks ago. The lending group owns the lake house now. They are locking the doors and auctioning it off by the end of the month. You have absolutely nothing to sell. The fallout was instantaneous and violently chaotic. Chloe let out a scream that shattered the heavy silence. It was not a cry of sorrow. It was a visceral, blood-curdling shriek of pure materialistic rage. She spun around and launched herself directly at her husband. Her hand cut through the air with terrifying speed, connecting with the side of Darius's face with a sickening wet smack. The sound of the slap echoed sharply off the linoleum floors and concrete walls, causing patients across the room to jump in their seats. "You lied to me," Chloe shrieked, her voice tearing at the seams. She struck him again, her heavy diamond engagement ring scratching a deep, violent red line right across his cheek. "You absolute miserable fraud. You told me we were rich. You told me the corporate accounts were frozen because of a banking error. You gambled away our entire life on basketball games. You stole from your clients. You let me walk into luxury country clubs and brag about our wealth while you were borrowing money from criminals. I am going to completely destroy you." Darius threw his hands up desperately, trying to block her manic, flailing arms. He grabbed her wrists, his face contorted in a mix of physical pain and profound public humiliation as they engaged in a chaotic, screaming scuffle right in the middle of the trauma center waiting room. Several hospital security guards immediately unclipped their radios and started jogging toward the commotion, but I held up my hand, giving them a subtle, authoritative signal to hold their position. I wanted them to feel every single second of this public, devastating degradation. Let them tear each other apart in the dirt where they belonged. While Darius and Chloe grappled, completely consumed by the violent destruction of their fake marriage, my mother began to physically collapse. Her knees gave out, and she sank heavily into one of the plastic waiting room chairs. Her hands gripped her hair, pulling at the roots as she rocked back and forth. The absolute denial that had shielded her for decades was finally violently breached. "No," Brenda gasped, her chest heaving as she struggled to draw oxygen into her lungs. "No, no, no. That is impossible. He would not do that to me. I sacrificed everything for that house. I drained my entire retirement account. I took every single penny I had to my name." I looked down at her, watching the tears finally spill over her eyelashes, ruining her carefully applied makeup. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, desperate agony that sought any form of comfort. "I took the $50,000 from your college tuition fund." She confessed the words, tearing out of her throat in a ragged, ugly sob. "The year you graduated high school, the money your grandparents left specifically for your education. I took it all. I took it, and I put it down as the cash deposit for that lake property so Darius could have a respectable asset to show his business partners. It was supposed to be his legacy. It was supposed to be the generational wealth of the Washington family. I gave him everything I had." The confession hung in the freezing air, a vile, toxic truth that finally explained the darkest, most agonizing chapter of my youth. I did not cry. I did not scream. I felt a cold, absolute clarity wash through my veins, solidifying the emotional armor I had spent the last 8 years building. "You stole my future," I stated, my voice as cold and hard as solid ice. I stared down at the woman who had birthed me, feeling absolutely no connection to her whatsoever. "You actively robbed your teenage daughter of her education. You forced me to claw my way through community college, working 3 grueling minimum wage jobs, suffocating under the weight of exhaustion and debt, just so your golden boy could have a luxury weekend party house to impress people who did not even care about him. You sacrificed my entire future to pave over his rot. You funded his delusions with my blood and sweat, and he took your profound, disgusting sacrifice and gambled it away on a basketball game." I watched my mother process the absolute destruction of her life's work. Her golden child was a criminal, a fraud, and a failure. Her daughter was a highly powerful, wealthy surgeon who owed her absolutely nothing. The reality was crushing, undeniable, and permanent. In a normal mind, this would be the moment of absolute surrender. The moment a mother begs for forgiveness and seeks desperate redemption. But Brenda Washington was not a normal mother. I watched the grief in her eyes curdle and shift. The tears stopped falling. She slowly lowered her hands from her face, wiping the smeared mascara from her cheeks with the back of her wrist. Her breathing steadied, taking on a harsh, ragged rhythm. She slowly stood up from the plastic chair. Her posture was rigid, her expression transforming from broken despair into a terrifying, unhinged, manic resolve. She looked past me, fixing her dead gaze on Darius, who was still desperately trying to restrain his screaming wife. "I still have the house I live in," Brenda said. Her voice was completely devoid of reason, vibrating with a sick, toxic devotion that defied all human logic. "I still have the primary residence on Buckhead Avenue. It is in a highly desirable neighborhood. The property values have skyrocketed. I will go to the bank first thing tomorrow morning. I will mortgage the Buckhead house, and I will use the cash to buy back the lake house for Darius. We will pay off the loan sharks. We will fix this. I am not letting my son lose his empire." My laughter finally subsided, leaving behind a profound, ringing silence that felt heavier than lead. The harsh, fluorescent lights of the emergency room seemed to spotlight the absolute devastation radiating from my family. The intake nurses at the main desk were completely frozen, their hands hovering over their keyboards as they watched the Washington family empire crumble into dust right in the middle of the triage waiting area. Brenda let out a guttural, clawing scream. She threw herself entirely onto the floor, her hands scraping desperately against the polished linoleum, as if trying to physically dig her way out of this nightmare. "Impossible!" she shrieked, her voice tearing at the seams, completely abandoning any remaining shred of maternal dignity. "That cannot be true. I poured my entire retirement fund into that property. I took your entire college tuition money from those accounts to buy that lake house for him. It was supposed to be safe. It was supposed to be his permanent asset." I looked down at her writhing form, feeling a profound glacial detachment. "Exactly," I replied, my voice dropping to a smooth, surgical whisper that sliced through her hysterical sobbing. "You actively robbed my future. You stole the only safety net I had, the only opportunity I was given just to cover up his absolute rot. You threw my life away to build a paper castle for a son who could not even bother to keep it standing." For a moment, the sheer weight of that truth seemed to physically crush her. She stayed hunched over her expensive clothes, wrinkling against the hospital floor. And then a deeply unsettling shift occurred. I watched her wipe her tear-stained face with the back of her trembling hand. When she looked up at me again, her eyes had gone completely manic, swimming with a terrifying, unhinged desperation that refused to accept defeat. "I still have the house I live in," Brenda gasped, her chest heaving as she scrambled to find a new delusion to cling to. "I still have the Buckhead house. It is prime real estate. I will go to the bank. I will mortgage it tomorrow morning. I will get the cash and I will redeem the lake house for Darius. I can still save him." If this very moment were captured on film, the camera would execute a slow, agonizingly steady pan. It would glide in a perfect, silent circle around my mother's kneeling, pathetic form, capturing the wild, delusional fire in her eyes, the smeared makeup tracking down her cheeks, and the frantic, grasping motion of her hands. The invisible lens would slowly pan up from the sterile hospital floor, completely ignoring the chaotic, screaming brawl still raging between Darius and Chloe, just a few feet away, to finally come to a dead stop right at the tips of my pristine designer high heels. I stood absolutely motionless within the eye of this violent emotional hurricane. The contrast between her frantic, groveling panic and my absolute statuesque stillness was mathematically perfect. I owned this space. I owned this entire interaction. I tilted my head, looking down the bridge of my nose at the woman who had birthed me. "You plan to mortgage the Buckhead house?" I asked, the words slipping from my lips with a dangerous, quiet amusement. Brenda nodded frantically, her hands gripping the edges of my white medical coat, as if I were her savior rather than her executioner. "Yes, yes, it has so much equity. I can get a massive loan. I can fix this." I gently but firmly peeled her grasping fingers off my pristine coat, letting her hands drop back down to the floor. Did you miraculously forget what you did 2 years ago, Mother? I asked, my tone conversational but laced with lethal precision. Did you somehow erase the memory of secretly walking into that boutique lending office and using the Buckhead house as direct collateral for Marcus? At the mention of her youngest son, Brenda physically flinched. The manic fire in her eyes flickered instantly, replaced by a deep, sudden spike of genuine terror. Oh, you thought nobody knew about that little arrangement? I continued, taking a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing her to lean back awkwardly to maintain eye contact. You thought you could keep it a secret that you leveraged the very roof over your head to secure an exotic auto loan so Marcus could buy that ridiculous, overpriced supercar he could not actually afford. You actively gambled away your primary residence so your other golden boy could play pretend billionaire on social media. And according to the centralized credit database, you are exactly 6 months behind on those payments. The air in the room seemed to instantly evaporate. Behind me, the vicious cursing match between Darius and Chloe suddenly paused. Darius whipped his head around his bruised, bleeding face, contorting into a new mask of fury. You gave the house equity to Marcus. Darius roared, his voice cracking with a toxic mix of betrayal and entitlement. You told me there was no equity left when I asked for a business loan last year. You gave it to that useless idiot for a car. Chloe let out a scream that shattered whatever restraint she had left. She spun around and launched herself directly at Darius. Her hand cut through the air with terrifying speed, connecting with the side of his face with a sickening wet smack. You lied to me, she shrieked, her voice tearing at the seams as she struck him again, her heavy diamond engagement ring scratching a deep red line across his cheek. You absolute miserable fraud. You told me we were rich. You gambled away our entire life. I am going to completely destroy you. Darius threw his hands up desperately, trying to block her manic, flailing arms. He grabbed her wrists, his face contorted in a mix of physical pain and profound public humiliation as they engaged in a chaotic, screaming scuffle right in the middle of the trauma center waiting room. Several hospital security guards immediately unclipped their radios and started jogging toward the commotion, but I held up my hand, giving them a subtle, authoritative signal to hold their position. Let them tear each other apart in the dirt where they belonged. Brenda did not even look at her eldest son being assaulted by his wife. She was completely paralyzed, staring up at me with her mouth hanging open. How do you know that she stammered, her entire body shaking so violently that her teeth chattered? Her voice dropped to a desperate, pathetic whisper. The bank told me they were restructuring the account. They said they sold my debt to an asset recovery company. They promised they were not going to foreclose. They have not even come to the house yet. The sheer blinding magnitude of her financial ignorance was almost physically painful to witness. She had spent her entire adult life masquerading as an elite upper-crust matriarch, aggressively looking down on anyone she deemed poor or uneducated, yet she fundamentally did not understand the basic mechanics of the predatory debt she had drowned herself in. She honestly believed that a polite phone call from a debt buyer meant she was safe. I looked at her trembling frame, feeling the last remaining threads of familial obligations simply dissolve into the freezing hospital air. You sold your soul, your security, and your daughter's future to feed the shallow, insatiable vanity of your sons, I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality. You allowed Darius to embezzle and gamble away a fortune, and you enabled Marcus to drive around in a depreciating asset while your mortgage fell into severe default. You thought an asset recovery firm buying your debt meant you were safe. It does not mean you are safe, Mother. It means the bank wrote you off as a completely toxic, unrecoverable liability. It means they sold the rights to your home to a private entity that specializes in aggressive, immediate liquidations. Brenda let out a soft, whimpering moan, wrapping her arms around her own torso, as if trying to physically hold her shattering world together. The Buckhead house was her final fortress. It was the address that gave her access to her exclusive social clubs, the zip code she weaponized against her friends, the physical proof of her perceived superiority. Knowing that it was entirely compromised, that she was effectively a squatter in a home owned by a ruthless recovery agency, finally broke her. Chloe, realizing the absolute comprehensive financial ruin of the entire Washington family, let out a disgusted scoff. She ripped her arms free from Darius's weakened grasp. She turned on her heel, her muddy designer sandals squeaking loudly against the floor, and began marching toward the hospital exit, completely abandoning her husband, her sick child in the intensive care unit, and the entire situation without a single backward glance. Darius reached out, screaming her name, his voice cracking with pathetic desperation, but she did not even pause. The rats were actively fleeing the sinking ship. But I was not quite finished. The surgical dismantling of Brenda Washington required one final precise incision. I maintained my unwavering eye contact with my mother as I slowly reached my hand into my expensive structured leather handbag. The movement was smooth, practiced, and entirely deliberate. My fingers brushed past my wallet and my hospital credentials, wrapping around the stiff premium cardstock of the item I had been waiting all evening to deliver. I pulled my hand out of the bag, holding a sleek, unblemished black envelope perfectly positioned between my index and middle fingers. The matte black paper seemed to absorb the harsh fluorescent light of the emergency room, looking heavy, ominous, and entirely out of place in the clinical environment. Brenda stopped rocking. Her tear-filled eyes locked onto the black envelope, her pupils dilating with a primal, instinctual dread. She did not know what was inside it, but the absolute cold certainty in my posture told her everything she needed to know. It was the final nail in the coffin. It was the ultimate, inescapable consequence of a lifetime spent worshipping fake status while destroying the only person who had ever truly worked to build something real. I held the black envelope out, suspending it in the empty space between us, waiting for her to reach up and take it. Brenda did not move. She stared at the matte black envelope suspended in the sterile hospital air, as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow jerks, but her arms remained tightly bound across her torso. The manic energy that had fueled her desperate plan to remortgage her life just seconds ago had completely evaporated, replaced by a suffocating, paralyzing dread. She knew, with the primal instinct of a cornered animal, that whatever was inside that envelope was going to eradicate her final remaining delusion. When she refused to take it, I let the envelope slip from my fingers. It fluttered downward and landed with a sharp, definitive smack against the thick, polished glass surface of the protective triage counter next to us. The sound was not particularly loud, but in the dead silence of the emergency room, it cracked like a gunshot. "Open it," I commanded. My voice was no longer raised. It was a soft, glacial whisper that carried absolute, unquestionable authority. Brenda flinched. She looked at Darius, desperately seeking someone to shield her from reality, but her golden boy was entirely broken. He was leaning heavily against the concrete pillar, his face bruised from his wife's assault, his eyes staring blankly at the floor. He had nothing left to give her. Slowly, with hands trembling so violently she could barely articulate her fingers, Brenda reached out and picked up the black envelope. She fumbled with the wax seal, tearing the thick paper in her frantic haste. She pulled out a small stack of crisp, heavy legal documents. The pristine white paper contrasted sharply with her shaking, sweat-slicked hands. "Read the letterhead." "Mother," I instructed, taking a slow, measured step forward. My designer heels clicked methodically against the linoleum, each step sounding like the ticking of a countdown clock. "Who is the registered corporate entity that purchased your toxic, defaulted mortgage on the Buckhead house from the bank?" Brenda blinked rapidly, trying to force her tear-blurred vision to focus on the sharp black text embossed at the top of the page. She squinted, her lips moving silently as she read the words. "J. W. Medical Investments." She breathed, her voice a fragile, confused rasp. I smiled. It was not a smile of joy, but the cold, predatory baring of teeth. "That is correct," I said, my voice echoing smoothly through the waiting area. "J.W. Medical Investments, LLC. A private aggressive asset recovery and portfolio management firm based right here in Atlanta. They buy high-risk, unrecoverable debt for pennies on the dollar and liquidate the physical assets immediately. They are completely ruthless, incredibly efficient, and they do not negotiate with delinquent borrowers. Brenda looked up from the paper, her face a mask of absolute uncomprehending panic. But you said they owned my house. Why are you showing me this? Because, Mother, I whispered, tilting my head as I watched her entire world shatter. JW stands for Jakina Washington. The silence that slammed into the room was cataclysmic. It was a thick, suffocating vacuum that instantly sucked the remaining oxygen from the air. Brenda stopped breathing. Darius's head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes widening to the size of saucers. Even Chloe, who had been aggressively marching toward the exit, froze dead in her tracks, her expensive boots squeaking to a sudden halt against the polished floor. I own the company, Mother, I stated, driving the blade of truth directly into her chest with surgical precision. When your bank flagged your mortgage for severe delinquency, they bundled it into a toxic asset package. My financial managers track distressed properties in premium zip codes. When the Buckhead address crossed my desk, I personally authorized the acquisition. The faceless corporate entity that bought your debt, the firm that legally owns the roof, currently sitting over your head, is me. Brenda staggered backward, her spine colliding hard against the glass triage counter. She gripped the edge of the glass to keep herself from completely collapsing. No, she gasped, shaking her head in violent, rapid denial. No, that is illegal. You cannot do that. You are a dropout. You are a failure. You do not have that kind of money. I ignored her pathetic, reflexive insults. They were nothing but the desperate, dying spasms of her lifelong narrative. But I did not stop there. I continued, my tone shifting into an even darker, more punishing register. Because I knew Darius's gambling debts were going to inevitably catch up with him. I knew the predatory lenders he used to secure the Lake Oconee house would not wait around for him to miraculously invent the cash. So I had my legal team monitor the county foreclosure registries. I watched Darius carefully. The color was draining from his face at a terrifying speed. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords were completely paralyzed. He knew exactly what I was about to say. When the loan sharks filed the final default notice and put the Lake Oconee house up for private expedited auction last Friday morning, they just wanted quick liquid cash to cover Darius's massive betting losses, I explained, savoring the absolute destruction radiating from my brother's eyes. They did not care about the generational wealth of the Washington family. They cared about clearing their books. So JW Medical Investments stepped in. We wired the funds directly to their escrow account. We bought the deed outright, free and clear of all previous encumbrances. I took one final step forward, invading the physical space of the people who had spent my entire life, making me feel incredibly small. The person who bought your bad debt from the bank, Mother? I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying, deadly calm. And the person who won the auction for the Lake Oconee house from the loan sharks last Friday morning is me. The Washington family empire was officially, mathematically, and legally eradicated. The profound cosmic irony of the situation settled heavily over the emergency room. The people who had ruthlessly drained my college fund, who had spent decades screaming that I was an uneducated, ugly college dropout, who had publicly humiliated me just 30 minutes ago in front of our entire extended family, were now entirely at my mercy. I owned the ground they walked on. I owned the walls that sheltered them. Their fake, luxurious existence, their precious generational wealth, their unearned arrogance, it all currently resided in my personal investment portfolio. They were living on my charity, breathing my air, and standing in my shadow. Darius let out a low, whimpering groan and slid down the concrete pillar, pulling his knees up to his chest like a frightened, broken child. The imposing, aggressive alpha male who had tried to physically intimidate me just moments ago was gone. He was nothing but an empty, bankrupt shell staring at the floor as the reality of his complete financial and social annihilation washed over him. He had lost his job, his money, his wife's respect, and the family legacy, and he had lost it all to the younger sister he despised. Brenda could not even speak. The paperwork slipped from her numb fingers, scattering across the hospital floor like dead leaves. She stared at me, her mouth trembling, her eyes completely devoid of the fierce, arrogant pride that had defined her entire existence. She was looking at a stranger. She was looking at a titan she had entirely failed to recognize. She had spent her life worshipping the illusion of power, and now standing in the face of true, absolute authority, she was reduced to absolute nothingness. But the most spectacular reaction did not come from my mother or my brother. It came from Chloe. The sharp, aggressive click of her designer heels echoed rapidly across the linoleum. I turned my head just in time to see her sprinting back from the exit doors. The sheer, unadulterated greed that possessed her was a fascinating psychological study. She had just violently assaulted her husband for being broke. She had been ready to abandon her sick child to escape financial ruin. But the exact second she realized that the vast, limitless wealth she so desperately craved was standing right in front of her, she completely abandoned every single shred of human dignity. Chloe did not just walk up to me. She threw her body forward, dropping violently to her knees right in the middle of the emergency room floor. The expensive fabric of her designer dress pooled in the dirt and spilled medical fluids. She let out a loud, theatrical sob, tears magically springing to her eyes as she reached out with both hands. Before I could step back, her arms wrapped tightly around my calves. She pressed her tear-stained face directly against my shins, her manicured fingers digging desperately into the fabric of my trousers. "Jakina! Oh my God, Jakina, please!" Chloe wailed, her voice echoing with a sickening manufactured agony. "I did not know. I swear to you I did not know what Darius was doing. He lied to me. He manipulated me. He forced me to say those awful things to you at the pool today. You know I have always loved you. You know I have always admired you. You are the only real family I have left in this world." She tightened her grip on my legs, sobbing loudly into the fabric of my pants, creating a pathetic, groveling spectacle that made the hospital security guards physically cringe in disgust. "Please do not let them throw me and your sick nephew out on the street," Chloe begged, looking up at me with wide, manic eyes swimming in fake tears. "You own the houses now. You have all the money. You are so powerful. Just let me stay in the Buckhead house. Kick Brenda out. Kick Darius out. They deserve it for how they treated you. But please protect me and my baby. I will do whatever you want. I will be on your side. Just please show me some mercy." I looked down at the woman hugging my legs. I looked at the dark streaks of makeup running down her face, at the absolute shameless desperation radiating from her every pore. She was willing to throw her husband and her mother-in-law directly into the fire without a second of hesitation, just to secure her own comfort. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no triumph. Just the cold, sterile detachment of a surgeon observing a malignant, rotting tumor that needed to be permanently excised. I did not yell. I did not insult her. I simply looked down into her tearful, pleading eyes, feeling the absolute weight of my power coursing through my veins. With a slow, fluid, and incredibly deliberate motion, I gently but firmly pulled my leg out of her desperate, clinging embrace. Chloe collapsed fully onto the cold linoleum floor, her hands grasping uselessly at the empty air where I had just been standing. The sound of her weeping was shrill, ugly, and entirely devoid of any genuine sorrow. It was the sound of a parasite suddenly realizing its host was dead, the panicked thrashing of an opportunist who had just watched her entire manufactured reality burn to ash. I looked down at her, watching her expensive tangled blonde extensions mop the hospital floor, mixing with the dirt and scuff marks left by the boots of the security guards. "Get up, Chloe," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Yet it cut through her fake hysterical sobs with absolute, undeniable authority. "You are embarrassing yourself." She looked up at me, thick black mascara running down her flushed cheeks, her lips quivering as she tried to formulate another pathetic plea for mercy. "Jakina, please, you have to understand, I had no idea." I held up a single perfectly manicured finger, silencing her instantly. Her jaw snapped shut as if I had physically struck her. "Do not pretend you care about family loyalty, Chloe," I stated, my tone dripping with glacial contempt. "Less than 30 minutes ago, you demanded that the police be called. You actively tried to have me arrested for attempted murder. You wanted me locked inside a concrete cell so you could continue living your fake luxury lifestyle without interruption. You do not care about me. You only care about the houses. You only care about preserving your zip code and your country club status. You are not begging your sister-in-law for forgiveness right now. You are groveling at the feet of your new landlord, and I am entirely immune to your fake tears. I turned my attention away from her crumpled, pathetic form and looked back toward the main triage desk. The charge nurse was still standing exactly where I had left her, holding the silver clinical tablet, watching the scene unfold with a look of quiet, profound vindication. I gestured subtly toward the heavy plastic billing folder resting on the counter. The folder that contained the massive, paralyzing admission fee that Darius and Chloe could not afford. I looked back at my brother, who was still slumped heavily against the concrete pillar, and my mother, who was hyperventilating in the cheap plastic waiting chair. As for the actual reason you are all currently standing in my emergency department, I declared, my voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. The $25,000 medical bill required to admit Leo to the pediatric intensive care unit. They all froze. Even Chloe stopped her whimpering, holding her breath as a tiny, sickening spark of greedy hope suddenly ignited in her swollen eyes. Despite everything I had just revealed, despite the absolute destruction of their empire, they still honestly believed they could bleed me dry. They still thought familial guilt would force my hand. I paid it, I said flatly. I watched their shoulders drop in a massive collective wave of relief. Darius actually let out a long, shaking breath, running a hand over his bruised face. They thought they had won. They thought they had secured their bailout. I authorized the internal transfer from my personal accounts the exact moment the triage nurses alerted me to your financial insolvency. I continued, my voice hardening into unyielding steel. The balance is entirely cleared. Leo has been moved up to a private VIP recovery suite on the top floor. He is currently receiving the absolute best pediatric surgical care this hospital has to offer. He will have round-the-clock monitoring the finest specialists in the state and whatever premium medical resources he requires to make a full, complete recovery. I paused, letting my eyes lock onto Darius, making sure he felt the absolute crushing weight of his own failure as a father and a provider. Because he is a child, I stated, my voice slicing through the air like a scalpel. Because the boy is innocent. Because he did not choose to be born to a pair of vapid, materialistic frauds who prioritize leasing luxury sports cars and maintaining fake social media profiles over paying for premium health insurance. I saved his life today because it is my sworn duty as a physician to heal the sick, and because I absolutely refuse to let an innocent child suffer for the profound, catastrophic incompetence of his parents. I took a slow, deliberate step back, physically distancing myself from their toxic, rotting circle. But you need to understand something very clearly, I said, my tone dropping into a deadly, freezing register. That payment was not a bailout for you. It was not a gesture of family solidarity or forgiveness. It was the absolute last cent this family will ever receive from me. The bank is permanently, irrevocably closed. Brenda let out a strangled, horrifying gasp. The fragile, desperate relief that had just washed over her face instantly shattered. She pushed herself up from the plastic chair, her knees knocking together, her hands shaking so violently she could barely maintain her balance. The reality of her housing situation, the fact that the debt collector standing in front of her was not going to negotiate, was finally overriding her lifelong denial. "Jakina, please!" Brenda wept, her voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch that echoed tragically off the high ceilings. The arrogant, untouchable matriarch was completely gone, replaced by a woman consumed by naked, visceral terror. "Are you going to throw your mother out on the street? You cannot do this. You own the Buckhead house. You own the lake house. Where are we supposed to go? Where is Darius going to live? You cannot ruin us like this. I am your mother." If a camera were suspended high above us, slowly panning upward toward the vaulted ceiling of the emergency room, it would capture a perfect, symmetrical portrait of absolute defeat. It would look down on the sprawling, pathetic wreckage of the Washington family isolated in the center of the vast, sterile hospital floor. Darius broken and bleeding against a pillar. Chloe sobbing in the dirt. Brenda pleading with empty hands. and standing completely apart from them, pristine and untouched in my white coat, the absolute master of the board. I stared at the woman who had spent my entire life breaking my spirit to build up her son. I felt an immense, powerful calm settle over my soul. It was a profound, beautiful liberation. "No," I replied, my voice perfectly steady, carrying absolutely zero emotion. "You are Darius's mother. You made that abundantly clear your entire life. You made it clear when you stole my college tuition to fund his vanity. You made it clear when you let him physically and emotionally degrade me. You made it clear just 30 minutes ago when you stood in front of this entire hospital and called me a bitter, pathetic loser. You told everyone I was just playing house pretending to be a nurse. You made your choice, Brenda. You chose your golden boy. And now you get to reap the exact rewards of his financial genius." Brenda let out a wail, clapping her hands over her mouth as if trying to physically hold back her own destruction. "Tomorrow morning, I declare delivering the final inescapable verdict. My legal team will officially post 30-day eviction notices on the front doors of both properties. I will make sure the process servers tape them directly to the glass where all of your wealthy elite neighbors can see them. You have exactly 1 month to pack whatever cheap, heavily mortgaged belongings you have left and vacate my premises. I suggest you start looking for a very small, very affordable apartment, perhaps something in a neighborhood you used to make fun of." I offered her a sharp, mocking smile, a perfect mirror of the condescending smirk she had given me my entire life. "Have a memorable Juneteenth holiday." I turned away from them, raising my hand toward the security detail standing by the perimeter. Two large, uniformed guards immediately stepped forward, their expressions stern and professional. "Escort these individuals to the pediatric waiting area on the 4th floor," I instructed the guards, my voice echoing with clinical authority. "If they cause any further disturbances, or if they attempt to access the administrative billing offices, remove them from the hospital premises entirely." I did not wait to see my family's reaction. I did not look back at my mother as she collapsed back into the plastic chair, sobbing uncontrollably. I did not look at Darius as the security guards firmly grasped his arms to guide him toward the elevators. I simply began to walk toward the automatic double doors leading to the secure surgical wing. My designer heels clicked rhythmically against the floor, a steady, powerful drumbeat marking the end of an era. The heavy glass doors slid open with a soft electronic hum, welcoming me into the sterile, pristine quiet of the inner hospital. It was a stark, beautiful contrast to the pathetic, screaming wreckage I was leaving behind in the waiting room. But just as the toes of my shoes crossed the threshold into the secure hallway, I paused. I stopped dead in my tracks, the automatic doors freezing in their open position. I slowly turned my head, looking back over my shoulder into the chaotic waiting room. My eyes bypassed my weeping mother. They bypassed my ruined, broken brother being corralled by security. My gaze locked directly onto Chloe. She was still kneeling on the floor, staring after me with a look of absolute hollow devastation. I stared at her pale, tear-streaked face. There was still one final piece of business left on the table. One final devastating secret I had uncovered during my extensive months-long financial audit of Darius's life. A secret that had absolutely nothing to do with mortgages, fake credit scores, or embezzled corporate funds. A secret that was going to destroy the very last delusion Chloe was clinging to. I let my gaze drop from Chloe's desperate, tear-streaked eyes to the heavy, glittering pendant resting against her collarbone. It was her most prized possession, a massive vintage piece she constantly paraded around as physical proof of her elite old money lineage. "Oh, I almost forgot, Chloe," I said, my tone shifting into a conversational, almost casual rhythm that contrasted violently with her hysteria. "That priceless heirloom diamond necklace you are wearing. The one you so proudly flaunt at every country club dinner as a sacred gift from your upper-crust elite white family." I let a slow, pitying smile spread across my lips as I watched her hand instinctively fly up to clutch the stones. "You might want to ask Darius which exact month he took it to a downtown pawnshop." I continued enunciating every single syllable so the truth carried across the dead silence of the room. "You should ask him how much cash he got for the real diamonds to pay his bookies, and how much he paid the jeweler to swap them out for cheap commercial-grade cubic zirconia. Because from where I am standing, the light refraction is completely wrong. "Do not bring fake jewelry into my hospital." The horror that washed over Chloe's face was absolute and visceral. She looked down at the necklace clutched tightly in her fist, her knuckles turning bone white before slowly rotating her head toward her husband. Darius shrank back against the concrete pillar, his face draining of whatever color it had left. He raised his hands in a pathetic, trembling gesture of surrender. "Chloe, wait, let me explain." He stammered, his voice weak and trembling. She did not let him explain. Chloe let out a sound that was less of a scream and more of an apocalyptic roar. She lunged upward, transforming instantly from a groveling victim into an unhinged banshee. Her hand cracked across Darius's jaw with a sickening, resounding thwack that echoed through the entire trauma center. She launched herself entirely onto him, tearing at his expensive shirt, punching his chest, and shrieking incoherently as her fake diamonds swung wildly around her neck. The pristine emergency room waiting area instantly devolved into a pathetic, violent tragicomedy of shattered lies, exposed frauds, and broken egos. I did not stay to watch the rest of the performance. I turned my back on the screaming, the grappling, and my mother's continued breathless sobbing. I walked straight through the sliding glass doors, leaving the absolute chaos of the Washington family entirely behind me. As I stepped out of the sterile hospital air and onto the pavement, the warm, golden afternoon sunlight hit my face. I tilted my head up, letting the bright, unforgiving light wash over my skin. I took a deep, clean breath finally, and completely free. The brilliant, blinding sunlight of that hospital parking lot smoothly dissolved, shifting effortlessly into the warm, golden ambiance of my present-day living room. I sat back against the plush velvet cushions of my sofa, the soft jazz playing in the background, perfectly matching the quiet, peaceful rhythm of my new life. I raised a crystal glass of aged Bordeaux to my lips, taking a slow, appreciative sip as I reflected on the beautiful, absolute justice of the past year. The fallout from that day in the emergency room was as swift as it was permanent. Chloe kept her word, instantly filing for a vicious, scorched earth divorce the second she realized there was no money left to salvage. Darius was completely ruined, stripped of his fake corporate title, and suffocating under the weight of his remaining unforgivable loan shark debts. My once arrogant golden child brother now works the graveyard shift as a commercial janitor. He literally spends his nights mopping the floors of the very same downtown office buildings he used to pretend he owned. Brenda, stripped of her Buckhead mansion and her precious socialite status, was officially evicted and forced to move into a cramped, noisy, low-rent apartment on the far outskirts of the city. She spends her days bitterly complaining to anyone who will listen, entirely isolated in a prison of her own making. And the Lake Oconee property, the supposed crown jewel of their fake generational wealth, underwent a complete transformation. I poured my own capital into fully renovating the estate, turning that monument of toxic vanity into a private, fully funded retreat center. It is now a sanctuary exclusively dedicated to underprivileged African American female medical students, providing them with a safe, luxurious space to rest, study, and network without the suffocating burden of financial stress. They used to look down on me, I said, my voice steady and completely at peace, as the memory of their insults faded into nothingness. My family used to tell me that I embarrassed their grand manufactured illusion of Black excellence, but they were entirely wrong. True excellence is not found in flashy Gucci bags bought on maxed-out high-interest credit cards. It is not found in bragging about inherited real estate right before you blindly leverage it away to criminals. Real excellence is forged in the fire of hard work. It is about building your own foundation and standing firmly on your own 2 feet without stepping on the backs of the people who love you. I slowly lowered my wine glass, setting it down gently onto the polished marble coffee table. I leaned forward, looking directly into the lens, allowing a soft, deeply satisfied smile to finally touch my lips. Today, whenever my family is forced to speak my name, they have to bow their heads and respectfully call me doctor. But if I am being completely honest, I vastly prefer the sound of them having to call me landlord.